Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge, the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyard, where we are listening through the whole Bible in a year. And sometimes, this week in particular, I feel that has meant the pace that we're going through it has been kind of breathtaking and epic and awesome. What do you think, Owen?
Yeah, hi Bern. Yeah, and hi everyone. Yeah, I think epic is definitely the word for this, isn't it? It reminds me of a big movie with big events happening and, moving rapidly from one scene to the next. It leaves me quite breathless.
Yes, so I should explain, if you're just joining us, we're listening to the beginning of the books of Kings. Now, this is sort of midway through an even bigger story, really, which is attached to the books of Samuel. Samuel's story led us to King David, the man who was after God's heart, and a legendary king in the history of Israel, and all through the Psalms and all sorts of things that have lived on for thousands of years. And now we've got to the point where David is dying. So what happens next? What's going to happen to the kingdom? What's going to happen to his family? I've got to admit, as entertaining and kind of involving and engaging as a lot of these stories are, I must admit I found they do my head in.
Why is that, Ben?
Well, I think mainly because taking the Bible seriously, I want to be able to sort of take these stories and not just sort of understand them, but also know what we're supposed to do with them. And I think that's really difficult with a lot of these stories. So you're starting off with this story of who succeeds David? Well, shouldn't it be his oldest son? He's got an oldest son whose name is Adonijah, and he goes and assumes for himself the power because he knows who he is, and he knows that when David's dying, the kingdom should go to him. This wasn't just his idea, by the way. This was in the law. The law that was written about stuff like this took into account the fact that people often had more than one wife. So there would be an oldest son from one wife and another son from another wife and another son from another wife. And quite commonly, people might prefer one wife over another, and so want them and their oldest son to have all of the inheritance. And that was common practice in the neighbouring countries. But God had said very specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 21, if a man has two wives and he loves one but not the other, and they both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love, when he wills his property to his sons, he mustn't give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves in preference to his actual firstborn. So there's a clear law here that everyone seems to be breaking. And in fact, the author is saying, God himself is breaking the law here. God himself promises that the kingdom should go to Solomon, who isn't the oldest son. He's the oldest son of Bathsheba, who's David's preferred partner at this point. But, what's going on there?
Yeah, right. So from the offset, it's a little bit baffling.
Yeah.
And then he chooses Solomon. And we see this kind of handover in the same sort of vein as Moses to Joshua. When Moses was on his deathbed and hands over the leadership of the Israelites to Joshua, and he gives him sort of commands: do this, do that, and we see that between David and Solomon here. But then immediately after that, what David also then whispers in Solomon's ear is like, and just remember, make sure you murder that enemy and that guy that did me wrong. Make sure you kill him. And I love the phrase. I mean, it's not very nice, but I love the phrase like before his head turns grey, make sure he meets the grave, sort of thing. And it's just like, oh, okay, that's very kingly behaviour, isn't it? That's just kind of what we're expecting.
Yeah, it's baffling in a way because I guess on the one hand, I'm looking through it, looking for signs that the way God does things is somehow the fulfillment of the law, the bringing of peace, and the triumph of love or something. What is it? Is Solomon chosen because of the love that's involved with Bathsheba or something? And is that sort of bigger than the law? I don't know. I'd sort of like to believe that. But on the other hand, what about Adonijah? He really wants peace It seems like he's kind of going, well, actually, okay, I'm going to step back. I'm not going to try for the throne. I think God said, give it to Solomon, so let's go with that. Can I have a wife? It says to Bathsheba, and Bathsheba says, that sounds cool. I'll just ask Solomon. And Solomon goes, no, kill him. Oh, okay. So we'll go back to that then. All these things kind of look sensible in terms of kingdom building, people building kingdoms. What's God really doing here? I do find it kind of weird and baffling and very hard, I think, in some ways, to make any kind of moral conclusions about what to do with these texts. And yet they're still really involving. And you can clearly see God at work in them. It's just, we've got to spend a bit more time sort of soaking in them to marvel at how that really works.
Now, one of the keys to interpreting any part of the Bible is trying to understand the context in which this was written. And although we are reading about events that seem to look like historical events, and I'm not suggesting that they don't look like historical events, but what we need to understand is that these are being put together, and we know that because there's patterns and rhythms and symbolism within the stories. Scholars think that this would have been written around about the time of the exile of the Jews in Babylon, around about 550 years, they're give or take 50 years either side, before the time of Jesus. And so they're looking back. And what I find comforting in some ways, actually, is that the people who are recording these stories, they're not glossing over the faults of David and Solomon and the many kings that have ruled Israel. And there's an acceptance that they didn't always keep the commands, not just of the Torah, but also even what David passed on to Solomon. His advice to him in 1 Kings 2 is, observe the commands and the decrees, walk in obedience to God, and keep the laws and regulations according to the law of Moses. And if your descendants do that, then and they walk faithfully before God, then you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of on the throne of Israel. And it's like, oh, is that really how it's meant to be? Yeah, but there's almost like these people looking backwards, these Jews looking backwards and saying, do you know what? Our leaders didn't always get it right. Right. But God was still faithful, and I think that's the point they're trying to make. Even the kings, even the leaders of the nation weren't faithful, as evidenced by the mess that they created, and we can read about that. We've been listening to that, obviously. The God was still faithful in spite of that, and I think that's the sort of big story that I'm hearing through all of these smaller stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So I think remembering the perspective that this is actually being told probably at and for people who aren't living in this kind of glorious, almost paradise type of world that's being described around Solomon, but are living in something which is very, very different from that. And it's a perspective that really reminds me a lot about the stories of the Garden of Eden and the fall. We've talked very recently about the repeating patterns in the Bible. This seems to be another repeat of that pattern. Hey, look at what you could have had. Look at how life could have been until something happened. So working out then, what's the something? What's the something that got in the way? What got us chucked out of paradise is really important. But just to enjoy that picture of amazingness around Solomon just for a minute. He's the king of bling, isn't he? He's like
king of bling. Yeah.
He's got everything. God asked him what he wanted. He said, actually, I just want wisdom. And God says, what a good answer. You can have that. Oh, and you can have riches and blessings as well. It's like, oh, brilliant. What a good answer. And then you see him demonstrating his wisdom, and you see it happen in very personal ways, like the story with the babies and the mothers, as well as big symbolic, national, important monument sort of ways. So the whole scope of how human wisdom can show itself, from very personal relationships to, hey, look, I built the temple. Hey, look, I built a palace. Hey, look at how much gold we've got coming in. I just love the details that silver just wasn't worth anything in Solomon's day because it was just too common.
There's so much of it.
Yeah, it's too common.
Yeah.
And now remember that, because that's an important detail to come back to. when we get to the end. But in Solomon's day, all the gold. Can you imagine all the gold? Everything that we now have that's made of bronze or wood even used to be made of gold. And every year he had 666 talents of gold coming into the treasury. Well, that's an interesting number. One that we don't associate with good things these days, but was the pinnacle of good things, because it was 6 was 3 dimensions, double a multiplicity going on in each dimension. That gives you 6, and it's still one short of God's number. But 6 is as far as you can get with human effort, but not just 6, but 666. So in every dimension you've got 6s going on. 6 this way and 6 that way and 6 the other way gets you 666 in every direction. Solomon is the pinnacle of human effort and achievement, and so what goes wrong? I think we've already kind of led up to then what's going wrong, because and perhaps why it's so baffling as well, because I want to grab things out of Solomon's life and go, yeah, I want that because that's a good thing, like a good human thing to achieve. But perhaps it's just the whole point of the story was you can have everything human, but if you don't have God, if your heart's not really looking for God, then it's all going to fall apart. That's horrible.
That's right. And of course, his wisdom is what we associate with Solomon, isn't it? Solomon's wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon. That it's almost a cliche. And of course, the wisdom of Solomon was widely celebrated at that time. This was the heyday of the economic and political heyday of the Israelite nation under Solomon. At the center of it was the temple, and the temple itself, we read in chapters 5, or we listen to in chapters 5 verse 8, the sort of the descriptions of the ornate interior of the temple, and but this is very much designed to remind the people worshipping there of the sort of perfection, the sort of perfect world that they believe God created, Yahweh created for human beings to live in, and we would call that the Garden of Eden. And there's lots of symbolism there between the temple, and it's also the place of God's presence. That's the important thing, just like in Genesis we read about God being present in the Garden of Eden with the man and the woman. That's exactly what they expected. That's exactly what they believed was the case with the temple. So the temple was at the heart and was the reason for all of the blessing, if you like, upon the nation of Israel at the time in their heyday. But as you said, Bern, it all goes wrong. And I find it quite interesting that there's a reference here in Deuteronomy 17. You mentioned Deuteronomy 21 just now, which is kind of like the legal textbook for Israel, and what we read here in Deuteronomy 17 is all the things that a king shouldn't be and shouldn't do. And unfortunately, towards the end of Solomon's life, he becomes exactly that. It says in Deuteronomy 17, that he must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. and so what we see here is just Solomon really doing the very things that in Deuteronomy a king of Israel really shouldn't do.
Maybe that's what makes this story painful then, because I think I still, as a human being, I want to believe that blessing can be material. It doesn't have to be, but how often do I think, oh yeah, things are going well because I can see blessing, because we're comfy, or because we've got a lot of stuff. We must be blessed. And there's people who teach that is what blessing is, and I'm conflicted, because I sort of want to believe that. But on the other hand, God said, look, none of that really means anything. And Solomon, from the rest of what Solomon writes, there's actually comparatively little about Solomon in this book. But we've seen his wisdom already in Proverbs. We've heard how he's thinking about things in Ecclesiastes, and how he's blessing people and celebrating love in Song of Songs. We know a lot about how Solomon was thinking. We know that he got to the point where his material blessings, I guess, started to look like vapor. like meaningless, and he was sort of getting the point, but on the other hand, he was getting the point while he was in this particularly bad place. And I think we need to look at where the fall was. If this is a fall story, what was the fall in Solomon's case, and what does it tell us about us and anything else in general? I think this is an important message that the author's trying to get across to us. So, chapter 11 in 1 Kings, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you mustn't intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Now, again, painful. How much have we talked about love being like, oh, well, this must override everything. Love must be the most important thing. And love is super important. I genuinely believe that if we try and understand love through the lens of the law, we're going to get a very skewy view of the world. I think God wants us to understand the law through the lens of love and through the love that he can put into our hearts. But here's Solomon's problem, is that what he's doing, what he's calling love, his vast array of wives and his sort of international diplomacy projects, perhaps, of bringing all these people and faiths and things together, in a human way, it looks like he's solved everything and brought about world peace. But what God knows and what seems to get unfolded later is that by turning away from God and embracing these other gods, these other faiths, Solomon hasn't done the world quite so much of a favour as he's introduced things that were just rotten and were going to cause people suffering. We don't get to see the suffering on the streets until later in the story. When we get to chapter 17, we'll see a lot of how people were suffering as a result of all this going after gods. But suffice to say, I think this is the key message that the author wants us to take away, is that everything you have that looks like blessing and good human achievement, even if it looks like love, even if it looks like great diplomacy, if it's taking us away from God, it can lead to death. That's a clear message, but still a difficult one, I think, to put into practice, isn't it?
Yeah, very difficult to translate that into our lives. You're absolutely right, but very much made sense of the tradition amongst the Jews that the kings were required to worship the God of Israel alone and not any other gods. To always root out and rid Israel of any idolatry to other idols or nations, cultural gods, so to speak. And be faithful to the covenant. And what I find interesting about this as we look through Kings is actually what we find out, and I find this quite interesting. It's more relevant really to our second section of Kings that we'll come to next week. Is that we're going to see the split between Judah and Benjamin, and then the remaining 10 tribes in a moment. We'll just discuss that in a moment. But in the northern kingdom, that is the 10 tribes that split off in the north, we see that of the kings that obeyed God and were did right in the eyes of God, it appears zero kings did that, and 20 kings did evil in the eyes of God. But when we look at the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, but we generally call it Judah because that's the big powerful tribe, 8 of the Jewish kings did right by God and 12 didn't. So if you're looking, we're in the middle of the European Football Championship. If you're looking at a score, then the Northern Kingdom was 0-20 and the Southern Kingdom was 8-12. Still not great, but not surprisingly, we think that probably scholars think that this account of Kings would have been written by someone from the Southern Kingdom. Do
you think?
Yeah.
Now I need to get myself a wall chart, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
to make sense of some of these then, because there is, after Solomon, quite a lot of generations, quite a lot of kings, quite a lot of stuff happening. This sort of creates this dizzying effect of going through this quickly. And lest we miss it, I think there's just a couple of details that I wanted to like that stood out to me. Firstly, just the stupidness of some of the people. And like, how could Solomon's son be such an Egypt? Rehoboam like goes and seeks advice about how to treat his people, and his elders apparently give him good advice, and say just keep your people on side.
Treat them well.
Treat them well. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's what God would want. And then the younger people go, no. You need to be harder on them. You need to double down. And so he comes out and goes, oh, my father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Yeah. How do you think that's going to work out then? Strongman leader, tick. Support from people. It's just I wonder, depending on who gets elected in some of these elections, where countries are sort of mucking around with the idea of strongman leadership and doubling down on simplistic ideas and only treating certain people well and treating other people really badly, like that's a vote winner. What do you think's actually going to happen though if you do that? How do you think that's actually going to work out? Well, we've got the last century to look back on if you wanted to check some examples, but it's amazing how quick we forget. And that's the tragedy, I think, because you can see what's going to happen, and then all of these people, and Jeroboam, this interesting guy who's been promised the other tribes to the rest of the kingdom, and you think that would sort of glue him then to the word of God, so he'd be like all up for what God wants to do with him, but instead he goes off and does his own DIY religion. And goes, well, how are we going to stop people going to Jerusalem then? Because I'm all frightened of losing my people. Suddenly it's his people. If they go off to Jerusalem and worship God there, no. So let's set up our own altars then. In fact, we're going to need some idols. Let's make some golden calves. That works. I'll tell you what, I'll set up some festivals. This is how we do it. Yeah. This all sounds very godly. And
it also sounds very familiar,
doesn't it? Yeah.
It's funny that, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, I'm thinking, what is there a message for us in that? Yeah. Don't just do a bunch of religious things and think, oh, that'll do. It's the only important thing, the only real consistent message I'm getting through all of this is stick with trying to work out what God's really saying, like the real God. And then it's harder to go wrong. It's not impossible to go wrong, as we'll see in a minute, but it's harder to go wrong. But doing a bunch of things that just look religious, no thanks. That's just chaos. And then the weirdest story of all, I think, in this whole section, this unnamed man of God. Who is this man of God? I always think, I don't know, there aren't many people in the Bible who don't get named. But when they come up, I'm thinking they're usually people that you think, actually, no, they're probably the real deal. Maybe they're angels, maybe they're Christ, maybe they're something, that people just couldn't understand. And so, we don't need to know. We can't know their name. They're just a man of God. And this amazing story where he sort of has this set to with Jeroboam, and Jeroboam tries to smack him, and then his hand shrivels up, and the man of God kind of gets intercession and restores his hand and gives Jeroboam the word from the Lord, and it's like, wow, that's a proper man of God. And he's not gonna take his hospitality because he's been told not to take any hospitality, and he goes home a different way. Very mysterious. Okay, that story could have ended there. There was a man, but it doesn't, because what's going on with this lying prophet who comes out and just decides he's going to lie to him and say, oh yeah, God said you can come and have a snack though, and so he goes, oh okay, and then the word of God really does come through this other prophet who says, You disobeyed God. You didn't do what God was really telling you to do. And then the man of God goes and he gets killed by a lion. What? What's going on there? What are we meant to learn from that?
I think what we learn from that is that lions existed in the land of Canaan at the time of the kings.
Yeah.
Maybe that's all we can.
I don't know.
Maybe escape from the zoo.
The best I can. I now I have had a look. There are a lot of scholars who think this story is full of meaning about symbolic things about the kingdoms and how they got on with each other and how they were not trusting each other and all this sort of thing. And it could all be lots of that. I'm guessing the impression I'm just left with though is prophecy's hard. like really, really working out what God's really saying can be difficult sometimes. And I'm remembering that this is being told to people who, if it's getting close to the exile, they will have been hearing lots of dodgy prophecy. As we'll see later on in the story, people keep getting told what they want to hear from prophets. People keep being told, "Oh, you're fine. God's not going to be too harsh with you," and they keep having to deal with the fact that actually what God wants to do is something really radical and different and difficult that's going to cause a lot of upset. And trying to discern what God's really doing, even through someone who looks very much like a man of God, is hard. I wonder if this is maybe a bit of a foreshadowing of that. Like, here comes a proper man of God, definitely blessed, but be careful, because really trying to work out what God's really saying through people is means you really got to be looking for God and not just looking for holy looking people.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And I think also, I think it's worth remembering that who's the people that are writing this and assembling this from the historical records, if you like, of Judah and Israel. They are Jews. They're from Judah. And this man of God was from Judah. And he was speaking effectively against Jeroboam and the idols and the temples that they'd set up in Samaria. And I think what we're seeing here is, to some extent, is this sense of judgment against Israel, because what we're going to see, without wanting to spoil the story, is if you like, the destruction of the northern kingdom. But we'll get to that, because I just wanted to also, if I can just finish with this split between the north and the south, because I think it's quite significant. If you like, the remnant that Jesus was part of, and I mean, we don't talk about it sounding like a remnant, but it was the remnant, was the Jews. It was the Judahites. The southern kingdom became the dominant tribe in what we know of as Israel at the time of Jesus.
And thinking of the time of Jesus, one of the things that stands out to me in the Gospels is the relationship between Judah and the people who have the temple and access to God in the temple that's been restored then by Herod, and the people just over and on another hill, the people of Samaria. We hear about those as outsiders.
Yeah.
But we get here, it's in 1 Kings chapter 16, we get the origin story of Samaria. It's a city built on a hill. It's built by the king of Israel, and it sort of looks to me a lot like a sort of a shadow Jerusalem. It's like you've got your Jerusalem there with your temple. Well, I'm going to build this city on this hill. And he bought the hill for 2 talents of silver. Remember how we noticed earlier on, silver was just worthless. Well, presumably not in Omri's day. It's 2 talents of silver to buy a hill that you could build a city on. That's probably a fair chunk of change. But that's what it was in the big scheme of things. I think the story is being told. You have all this building going on, but what's it really worth? And what is he really doing with it? What did he want to do with it? He wanted to build a temple. Who's it a temple for? A temple for a different god. He put a temple and an altar to this god, Baal. And because he did that, the writer of Kings says he did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel before him. And that's leading us into this showdown that we're going to get next. A showdown particularly over Baal. And what does God say about life where we've chosen another God? Where is the value? Where is the power? And what's happening with people who just happen to be around leaders like that? We will find out in the very next chapter when we look on the streets and see how God is starting to work there before he has this massive encounter with the prophets of Baal in a very famous story.
So we got to the point of Elijah and Elisha. We're not going to ruin the story anymore for you. Go ahead, listen to it. We'll look forward to meeting back with you next week and talking about it some more.
See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.